Okay. So, as I already mentioned, this is our season finale, and this is served to you by me. I'm Amadea, Tina, Anna, and Eva. We've been your hosts the whole year. And of course, we have some drinks principles. We're here to include people, to build a community. We want to get to know each other, share knowledge and experience, and together scale up. And of course, grab a drink. So if you haven't done that, there's a tiny bit of time still left. As you are probably used to after the year behind us, mics off, burning questions in the chat. There will be some time to answer it at the end. Video on if you're not shy, and you can rename yourself always. So what's in the store for us today? First, a little bit recap of our year. Then Jesse will present how to turn into a chameleon. We'll have a Q&A, and everybody is invited to our backstage, which is just unstructured conversation without recordings, etc., etc. Okay, so season 2021 in numbers. This is our 9th event. So 5 of them were in Slovenian. This year we tried to really bring this to Slovenian space because all 4 hosts are Slovenian. 4 were in English and we're also international. So this is our 4th. 8 events were running overtime. We'll see if we manage this time any better. We had 14 guests. We created 44 Miro boards and possibly today some more. The approximate number was about 30 people per event. We had 40 plus meetings to make this happen. We ran on free platforms and had 100 plus social media posts. 200 people applied on just a meetup. And we created 1 YouTube account with 6 videos and 186 views, and we are very proud. We had really awesome guests in a very awesome year. We hosted Tilen, where we were talking about what's the difference between developing a food product compared to digital products. Then we had Marcus Worms from Workplay Experience and Lisa Tor from Eon. They presented a project on, with our Anna, they presented a project on software rollout in a company and how to do it right. Then we had our annual Fail Fest, where we celebrate our fails. Josh joined us from cleantech. We had the awesome Laura, who's Slovenian living in Portugal, and she does awesome stuff in research and social design and everything. We had Janže from Outfit 7, who was supposed to talk about UX in gaming, and then it turned into emotions and imposter syndrome and all things that are very important in our work and happen to all of us. We had a team from 3FS, Aljaž, Pika, and Lorna, who presented us how to sell research, which is always a great topic. Alen Fajlić from the MBA, talking about strategic design, and today, Jesse. Of course, this is something that we do from passion, and we try to put ourselves out of our comfort zones. So for me, it was overcoming my nerves with public speaking. There's still some there, as you can see, probably. Tina is very proud of herself because she put her camera on and she showed herself to people. Anna had a win to reflect on a project that she did a while ago with her client and co-facilitator, which is something that we rarely get to do. And Eva is now okay with uncertainty. So not having everything planned and just trust the team, which is quite cool stuff. And I collected a bit of community feedback, my favorites. So it was looking forward to the next event, being part of the community, heartwarming experiences, wholesome experiences, not what we were expecting, which is always a good thing in my book. And so thank you to everyone who was part of these events. Thank you for joining us today. And now, since you've came for Jessie, probably, I will leave the floor to Anna.
Yes, so today is my honor, and I'm really happy to be able to host Jessie with us. That's going to talk about service design and startups. I've met Jessie I actually looked it up just earlier. It was October 2016 in Barcelona at Service Design Days, and we participated in a workshop together. And I couldn't remember the name of it. Jessie might remember, but we kind of ended up grabbing a coffee together, and the rest is kind of history. He's been here twice already, and he's kind of guilty of getting me a service design job in a startup. And as many of you know, Jessie is many things. So he's an independent service designer consultant, working, I forget how many years, Jessie, I think you're going to share then, but I think at least 3 years. After I left my corporate job, you left your job fairly early on. So, and next to this, he's also very involved in the Service Design Network as an editor of the Touchpoint and on the board for the Service Design Academy. I am really excited about this talk, so I'll just pass it on to you, Jessie.
Okay, thanks, Anna. And yes, it's great, actually. I mean, if you're working for a startup as a service designer, you're living proof beyond me that this is possible. So it means that if you take nothing away from this talk, you don't need to think we're lying, because it's true, it's possible. I'll share my screen just to get started. Thank you, everyone. I mean, thanks first for the organizers for the chance to speak here, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm going to split my talk into kind of 2 parts. First, get about halfway through what I want to share with you, and then we're going to have an activity in the middle based on some of my thinking on the difference between service design and startups. So you'll have something to do in groups in Miro, and then I'll finish the talk and we can have some discussion afterwards. So I will share my screen first. Can someone just say that you're seeing the screen fully, properly?
Yeah, we are.
Okay, great. So yeah, thanks for having me here. Just as a little introduction, I think I'll go through this quick because Anna gave a nice introduction. I've been doing about 22 years of design experience in general, but service design work since 2008. I am involved in the service design community in general, so I'm not only here in the Netherlands where I live, involved in a local chapter of the SDN, but also a role with the global SDN. Touchpoint, which is the journal of the SDN, is something that I work on, and as you'll see, it has a connection to the talk in my work today. And as well, I teach service design, and since the last years, really my focus has been on service design for startups and for innovators. So since 2016, really. And the issue I'm going to share with you at the end, some resources. There's an issue of Touchpoint, which was really specifically on this topic. I have a contribution in there, which my talk is a little based on, but there's some other great contributions from other people. So if this talk interests you, you'll have a lot more reading material at the end. I'm going to go in kind of 2 perspectives here. The first is what I see as the value of people like me, people like us who identify as service designers for startups, but then also the challenges and what makes it a bit difficult. Why the fact is that if you walk into a typical startup, you're not going to find many people, if at all, really walking around with the job title of a service designer. To start with the first one, and why I think actually we're important. I did, even now a couple of years ago, had a quick look at how startups are divided across sectors, across industries. And as you probably are all familiar, the banking industry or fintechs is full of startups. And actually, it turns out there's a conference that's been going on for years now aimed at designers working for fintechs. They try to attract attendees to this conference by name dropping all the design roles of why you should be attending if you're a designer working in a fintech. But quite noticeably, there's not one mention of service designers there. There aren't really service designers walking around in startups, and therefore they're not even really addressing them in these conferences. But I think it's a bit of a missed opportunity. I think, and this is kind of my motto with starting any kind of engagement, I think that our work and the way that we think as service designers can help startups, can help innovators deliver better products, have better, stronger customer relationships, and deliver even more value than they could be having without us. Now, where does that opportunity for service design exist? If you look at a typical innovation process, how startups work, there's this idea of, okay, we're going to develop a concept, test it, and scale it. And this is really, if you consider where service designers normally work and what we're comfortable with, it is really a bit different. It's a lot of pressure in these first two phases, a lot of stress on a small team to figure out what's being built, what we're going to test. There's a lot of iteration. You can literally come into the office from one day to the next and find that what you're building, what the whole startup is about, has changed. And that's really kind of different from our way of working. And what these startups are trying to build is usually measured in three ways. A successful startup or a successful innovative idea is one that's creative. It's the concept that you've got, but it's also something that has some business value. It's delivering value to the end customers, to people who are trying to be served by their products or services, but also that it's viable, that it's a running business. So all these three things need to be met for any startup's concept to make sense, to be kind of winning. And I'm confident that for two of these, service design definitely plays a role. That concept, the idea of how you come up with the idea, the research, and how research can demonstrate that you're delivering value are really the strengths and match the skills of service designers. The viability aspect, does this make business sense, can also be a place where service designers can play a role. Now, what are the things that we're comfortable with as service designers, and where do they fit among these three characteristics of a good startup, a good innovative concept? Around the concept side, we're comfortable with co-creation, ideation, running workshops with our stakeholders about what it is that they find valuable, what they use, what we can deliver to them. And through our research, we can determine, is that really delivering value? What does that whole experience look like, taking this perspective of the whole ecosystem, making prototypes, making simple things that we can test quickly and see if it's working or not, and other user research techniques. And for the viability side, for those of us that are comfortable with business design, I know that was the last talk from the meetup that I actually attended. This is a place that we can also play a role. So then it's actually really across all three success factors. Now, here I'll share something that you may be familiar with if you've been doing that Google Ventures design sprint concept, where a team within a really short amount of time, 5 days typically, tries to come up with a new concept. It's divided in this idea of spending a first day to figure out what the context is, in the second day trying to create solutions, in the third selecting one, in the fourth building it, prototyping it, and getting out on the fifth day into the real world and testing it, seeing if it works. Now, of course, this is already really radically different and better than a lot of organizations in terms of how quick you can come up with an idea. My criticism as a service designer, though, is it still leaves this whole concept of doing the testing and understanding who our users are and really how they respond until that very last day. I think there are opportunities to use our skills and bring them much earlier into to that 5-day sprint, doing contextual research from the very first day, doing journey mapping on the first day, getting involved in co-creation and this view of what the entire context of the service is, the service ecosystem is at the time you're thinking of solutions, getting users involved in the selection of those solutions to be prototyped, getting them also involved in the creation of prototypes even, and of course then a lot of different techniques we can bring in from the user research side in terms of testing. Broader techniques, I would say, than startups are usually familiar with or have applied in the past. Now, I've got about 7 little contrasts here to talk about why I think service design and lean startup, to use a real named methodology from the startup world, are not the most comfortable of bedfellows to begin with. What might explain a little why we're not so common in these settings. So I'll present a few of them, and then I actually want these first 3 to be the basis of our activity. So I'll go through 3, we'll have an activity and discussion, and then I'll finish up with the other ones and finish off my presentation. But to begin with the first 3, lean startup, if you read the books that have come out of Silicon Valley, the success stories of where startups come from and what type of work a new startup should be following, they don't really aim to have any deep understanding of who their users are. There's this simplistic view of what is the pain that our customers or our target audience are having, and does this product that we want to create relieve that pain? If it does, we're kind of satisfied, at least in the beginning, that that's successful. I think as service designers, we want a much richer view of who those users are, the context of their life, their situation. Only then moving into what the service that we're going to be, or the product we're going to be developing, looks like, and then really seeing what that matches through a richer set of tools and a better way of understanding them. So that's a first kind of challenge or contrast. And speaking about that type of research, lean startup is also, I think, typically very simplistic in terms of how it goes about concept validation. Landing pages would be created that are really pretty fake. There's nothing behind them, but just the idea is you start to see if there's a little bit of traction. There's a lot of use of Facebook. And I'll say, for one thing, I'm working with an agriculture startup at the moment who my target audience are farmers, and farmers who are several decades older often than most of us. Facebook is not going to be a way to ever reach them, but if you would be building a startup and following the book, you'd be thinking, okay, I've got to use Facebook and a lot of these digital experiments to see if our concepts are working. And then even just recognizing that if someone intends to buy a service, this is the be all and end all measure that we've got something successful to begin with. Whereas I think in service design, there's a lot broader range of prototyping techniques we can bring to this question of, do we have a good concept, and how do users react to it? That's going to be much of a richer set of insights. And as a third one, and this is, I think, a criticism or a kind of a factor that anyone who's worked in not even just startups, I think this can be a easy trap for many organizations or people to fall into. Lean startup often begins with, even if teams don't want to admit it, and the books don't really say you should work this way, a solution. The idea that, okay, we've got a hammer that we want to build, and we're going to go out there and look for the nails. We know there's a solution, and it's got to make sense. People must want this, and we're going to go off and build it. And just to kind of get through the process of build and measure and learn and get that match and grow. And I think service designers pride themselves in loving that problem and not loving the solution, not assuming that what we're going to build and what we have in our mind is going to be the successful, what's successful when it's eventually launched. So we really want to grasp the whole context of how that product is going to be used through understanding really deeply who those customers are, what opportunities they have, and only then move towards concepts and solutions and kind of testing. So that's the first 3 of my kind of contrasts, and I'd like to use them as the basis for our activity to come up. I'm going to share the screen, and maybe Anna or one of you can share the Miro link for everyone.
I will.
Okay, great. Now, 1 second. We've created a Miro board, and if you, so I'm assuming my screen is still visible.
Not yet.
No, okay, sorry. And okay, and now?
Yes.
Okay, so what we're going to do is divide everyone here into groups. So there's going to be several people in each group. And what I'd like each group to do is reflect on one of those two sets of contrasts that I just spoke about. So you're gonna find yourself in a breakout room in Zoom, and depending on what your breakout room is kind of numbered, find your way to the Miro board with your group number. And you're going to see that you're going to have one of those three things I spoke about. Either this concept that startups are really solution focused, whereas service designers should be problem focused, or this concept of startups just working with simplistic concept validation techniques versus service designers having a bigger tool set. Or the third idea that startups can get away with or think they get away with is really shallow understanding of their users, whereas service designers have a whole set of ways of understanding their users and creating things like personas and journeys. So you're going to find one of those being assigned to you as a group. And I'd like you to do two things in the time that you'll have together, which is going to be 12 minutes. That is to begin by first, saying hello to who's in your group, and then please be a bit vulnerable and share some example that one of you have where you think this has gone a little bit wrong, where you think in your own experience you had fallen into that more startup thinking way of doing something. And in this case, for example, we're a bit too solution focused. What was that problem? How was it recognized at what point as being kind of a problem that the team got into? And what was that kind of negative outcome? And then I'd like you to switch, and sticking with that example of whomever has proposed it, put on your service design thinking hat or your customer experience design or UX design hat and think, okay, what could we have done better in that case based on kind of what I've proposed as this better way that service design can think about the problem. And then we're going to come back and share the what each team has been talking about. If you find you've gotten through the first one and the answer pretty quickly, then I'd suggest that someone else in the group can share their own example and then restart it. What was an example of something where you thought this, in your experience, went a bit badly, and then how could a service design technique improved it? So that's kind of your assignment. I think you're going to get split off into groups, and then in about 12 minutes we'll come back. I'll try to maybe jump into the rooms and see how you guys are going. But good luck. I hope this is a good activity.
I shared the link to the Miro board. So you're all invited to go there. And Amedea is going to send us into breakout rooms. I'll also set the timer. So you'll know in the Miro how far we are. So have fun.
Okay, so we just went through 3 of these different things where I see a contrast and really a challenge between how lean startup and service design works. That was our last activity. And I've got a few more. The first is that there, I think, is this really often product-centric view within startups, the idea that you're building a product, that the language even filters down, the semantics filter down into the job titles, product designers, product owners, product mentality. Service designers, on the other hand, it's in our name as well, think about a service. What is not really something that's specifically tangible, but this much, this more theoretical concept of which a product is just one part of the experience. And that, funnily enough, even if it's just language, I think often makes it a challenge for the value of service design to get recognized when you're living in this world that really talks about products. Even if they're websites, it somehow kind of changes the discourse a bit too much. And also those products are often kind of considered in a vacuum. I've worked within client teams where one of the product owners is who I was working with at the time really was only ever responsible for the app. And the app was one part of a much richer service that we had, but her work was being measured on the success of the app. Her teams were only working on the app. She had no real idea and visibility about the other elements that were making up the whole service experience beyond how the app was being used. There were people invariably coming in contact with customer support, using our website. She didn't have a view of it, and that failure of just in her vision being limited to what the product was, I think really hurt this concept of trying to orchestrate this experience across different touch points. But service design brings with it, I think, this much more holistic understanding of a product in the context of the whole service in which it operates, this view of customer experiences happening over time in a customer journey, for example, and not just as a single standalone product. Startups also are really aiming at, this is one of the good things about the technique. How can we start to get something out there quickly and see how it performs? This idea of a minimal viable product, an MVP. However, it's usually only ever aimed to satisfy the most basic requirements and just get enough buy-in from, and I'll mention them in a moment, these early evangelists, these early users, to get it in the market before the startup is running out of funding. I think it's not really how service designers would normally work. I think we think from the beginning really about what that whole service will be, not just this minimal product, and making sure that it's something that meets the user's needs, but it's also usable and desirable, efficient, effective, all those kind of keywords of what service designers should be thinking about from day one, and not just launching with something that's simplistic. As I said, there is this idea also in the startup world that all we really need to do in the beginning is please these people who have a very specific pain, who are willing to part with money, for example, for something that solves their pain. And then just by getting them on board, it's got to work, we'll be successful, and we can adapt and improve the product to meet the more broader set of customers. I do think that we really, as service designers, think more broadly. I think we recognize that there's multiple target customer groups that are out there. We do things like research to understand who they are, create personas to document who they are, and try to create a service that meets those different needs, and not being satisfied with just someone who's willing to put up with a bad experience because it addresses one specific pain that they have. Now, I mentioned what are typically seen as these things that a service needs to be, and that is being lovable, that people really want to use it, that it's usable, that it delivers them some value, and that it can actually really be built. Startups, when they build a minimal viable product, are really only typically looking at that one thing in the very beginning, just this idea of feasibility. We've got something out there that does just enough for these demanding users, and then we'll get on to something better. I actually think if you look at it from a different perspective, creating this minimal lovable service, not just one that's viable, but that people really want to use, that they like using, that delivers some value, and that we were able to build it, is a bit more of a compelling aim to have. Now, having looked at this idea of, okay, what's the value and even what are the contrasts and challenges for service designers, what does it really mean if you find yourself in the situation and want to get it? This is where I think we can really be valuable. I've actually added a sixth, so I know it says 5, but I have a 6th as well. The first, and this touches on, of course, the title of my talk, I think it's about being a chameleon. If you are a service designer trying to make your way and work with startups, you have a lot of value. There's a lot of things you can do, but I don't think it makes much sense to be hung up on your name. I now, in the current client I'm working for, I had to actually write my email signature the other day, and I find myself writing that I do kind of 3 things. And when new colleagues join and I kind of talk about what I'm doing in the team, I end up describing myself with 3 different roles. Service design isn't really recognized, but I wouldn't say business design was much recognized either. But I think the fact is we need to figure out how to adapt to what needs a specific client has, not really say, okay, I'm here to preach and practice service design because this is what everyone needs, but rather figure out what is going to work there and position yourself to add that value in whatever way makes a lot of sense. I would also say that in the very beginning, this is one of the first deliverables and activities I ever do with a client. I started actually working with these back in 2008, even before I was ever working with startups. The name service ecosystem has different meanings and examples. If you go off and look on it on Google or Pinterest, the version I've had from that long ago tries to take this look with the user's needs in the center and bring the customer experience into this chronological view in which you say, okay, over time, what are the touch points that someone is going to interact with? What are the different kind of interactions they're doing? And create that visualization really on in your engagement with the client so that they see how you think. This, and one of the resources I'll share with you are some articles I've written about this, but this creates this understanding of how a service designer thinks, that it's not just building a single app, but actually there's a whole lot of touch points going to be involved in our eventual service, that there's a whole lot of interactions that users are doing. And even what's really critical, that those interactions and those touch points, some of them we control, some of them are in our control as the product or service, but there are a lot of related things that we don't have control over that our customers are still using. And we need to understand those because that's part of the context in which the customer is living. I think we need to be comfortable with canvases. We know that, I mean, service design itself, of course, has a world of things like customer journeys and the service ecosystem I mentioned. The world of startup works with canvases as well, things like the business model canvas, the value proposition canvas, lean service creation, which is a whole set of canvases made by futurists. Platform design toolkit, another whole set of canvases on designing services that are based on platform model. Our skills, our techniques, I think put us in good situation, good standing to work with canvases. It's really just to make sure that you have experience facilitating the kind of workshops. If you haven't created a business model canvas, there's lots of free content out there. There's a lot of courses, of course, too, to teach you how to do it. The value proposition canvas, if you're not familiar with it, sits really at the heart of how service designers should be thinking, but it's not part of the world of service design. If you can get familiar with these canvases, if you can run and facilitate workshops in your team that use the canvases, it syncs with the way that startups think, and it's a really valuable skill to have. Of course, also push this whole perspective of being a service. I mentioned earlier this idea that I was working with a client and one of the product owners whose team I was in at the beginning. And I was successful at one point because I moved out of her team and took on a more strategic role. But down at this product-focused team, I was constantly saying, look, I know we can perhaps make the best app, but if nobody is considering the fact that someone with a problem in the app is going to call up the call center or make a kind of a complaint on social media, and that the people in the call center need to support problems in the app, we're going to have a lot of problems. And the fact was they were not thinking that way. They weren't realizing that a customer experiences that service over time, over touch points. So make sure you think about and push everyone to realize that you're building a service at the end of the day, not just a siloed individual product. There is a whole lingo in the world of startups too about their funding, about how they go through the process of becoming investable and things like that. It is different. It is going to be new if your experience is only within big organizations or perhaps the public sector. It's not really hard to kind of understand it, but it may be alien at first, and you'll realize that it has to do with how startups are really different. So try to understand what they are, and you'll better understand what kind of what the big concerns of a startup are. And lastly, learn about value prop design, value proposition design. This is something where I think service designers were really, it's in our wheelhouse. It's something that we think about. We think effectively about a value proposition when we think about how we're best serving customers' needs. But the idea, the terminology of value proposition design is more unique to startups. A lot of the work I'm doing with my current client is, and I've almost been given the ownership of our whole value proposition, is just here. You won't find it talked about in the world of service design, but it is how startups think. And there's great books on it. And it's really something that should be kind of close to our heart, close to what we're doing otherwise, just in different words. So I'd like to end with some suggested reading. I will share this deck at the end, you'll have it. This was, and admittedly, my photo is a little old now. These are a bunch of books that I was reading as I started this, mostly on the world of startups, as opposed to specifically on service design things. The last thing is the toolkit from Futures I mentioned. And the sprint book in the middle, you might be well familiar with. The other ones I thought were all interesting. And of course, there's events and YouTube channels and conferences about this, but these were some things that I dipped into. That's my last slide. I know we've for sure got time for Q&A. I will share the slides on the Miro too, so to answer that question up front. But thanks for the time to speak to you tonight.
Yes, thank you, Jesse. So I'd like to invite everyone, if you have any questions, or we can also just have a look at the comments that came during your talk. How a lot of companies, I think it was Svenjano, that said that a lot of companies think of the service as an after sales or something that happens after we've sold normally a product.
Yep. I think there's, I mean, that even outside of this idea of startups specifically, there's the challenge of service designers being understood that it's not just about customer service. It's not, we don't do customer service design. Service isn't just when things go wrong. Service is this whole thing that people experience. So that, yeah, that can be a challenge. Maybe people can just, yes, read out loud for some of the, I saw some questions coming in, but I wasn't.
Karan has a question. Do you want to voice it?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right. And this has been my experience, where instead of mapping a touch point, we mapped a decision point. And that sort of helped us understand more about the user in terms of their perceptions on how they go about taking certain decisions in the before cycle, or before they come in touch with the service or the buying experience in itself. So are there any such tools or alternatives on those lines which help you map a decision point and not a touch point per se?
So I think customer journey mapping is the most, perhaps one of the most well-known deliverables of service designers. Service blueprints are probably a close second. Service blueprints to me are the kind of process-oriented documentation that can get across where decisions take place. A customer journey is typically just this linear description of a service, like telling a story, whereas a service blueprint can show the different moments in which things might go one direction or another. So, I mean, that to me would be an example of how to, I don't know how you documented it yourself, but that would be a way that I would do it. Those process diagrams in the end become, I think, some of the most valuable end deliverables of the work of a service designer.
Right, thanks. And yeah, we did something similar as well. So I just wanted to understand if we were doing it right or not.
I think the judge is how well your team found useful what you created. That's the, if you've been doing it.
Sure, right.
Anyone else? I had a question actually also when you talked about the service ecosystem, and the outer layer was phases, and you didn't get around to actually saying what you mapped there.
So normally when I do a whole customer journey, I think it often makes sense to chunk steps into phases. You can say there's, in the very beginning, orientation, awareness, onboarding or sign up, the day-to-day use. In fact, I often see the phases being the same names, no matter what the service is. And it sometimes also helps to take those phases as discrete chunks when you do journey mapping, even though ideally, you would research and document maps all at once. Sometimes when a service is so complex, it becomes kind of too much to bite off and chew at once. And the phases can make sense as a way to kind of chunk it up. Okay, what does our awareness and orientation phases look like? And then look at sign up as something standalone, and then look at day-to-day use or usage. So they're, to me, kind of just chunks of steps that make sense with a specific name.
I also have a question. It's actually about sprints. So you've mentioned it in the presentation, and there was a book. What's your take on sprint?
So you know what, I mean, I've seen people, and I really agree with him in the service design community, kind of criticizing the fact that the success of the design sprint concept has meant that businesses can kind of think, okay, we've run a sprint and that was design, that was innovation, that was research. We did it in 5 days. We've got to have come up with the right idea, and therefore we're off on the perfect path. Of course, I criticize that. I like the idea that you can get a whole bunch of people from a team or organization in a room to focus on one problem, to think in the way that users think. A lot of that aspects of design sprint are good. But my own concern is that it oversimplifies the kind of work we do. It means that you can have teams who think, okay, you know, we've done it. We spent that time in a room thinking about it, and this is kind of right. And that fundamental criticism I had too, that it kind of pushes this idea of user research to the very end. That you've done user research if you get a pass or fail on the did they use it test, versus I think there's a lot more places that service designers should be doing research before that last thing. I would say, again, if I look at my current engagement, design research is one of the biggest things I'm doing, because I'm the one out there meeting our potential customers and stakeholders and bringing that back into the team. And I think that's one of the most valuable parts of a service designer's toolkit you can bring into a startup, is how to do design research.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, please.
So how do you go about finding clients?
That's a good one. You're not going to find startups advertising for service designers. That's really true. If you're someone who's come and maybe here in this community from the world of UX design, like I did actually, and you start to learn more about service design, that could well be a foot in the door. You find an opportunity with a startup where they need a UXer. They always need UXers, I think, if they have any aspect of a digital service. And that gives you the opportunity, as long as you're comfortable to still do some of that work, to start applying service design at the same time. Also, if you have the chance to work within accelerators or innovators, so that is environments where a specific company is supporting a lot of startups at once, and where your bills, you're being paid by the accelerator to support startups, that's great. That's actually how I made my start back when I was first doing this. I was working with an accelerator supporting a lot of individual startups. They all saw my value really quickly once I was there, but they were lucky because they had me provided for free along with a whole bunch of other resources. I probably wouldn't have convinced them easily up front. Okay, you need someone like me and my skills, but they were part of the package of support that the accelerator teams were getting. And that was enough to give me roles within those teams. In my case, I've been lucky to have startups now reach out to me and say, okay, I know you have something to help with startups. But I think that is a little bit more of a challenge. So try to find environments where startups are kind of working together. Give a talk in your community on the value. Try to be a chameleon. Go in as either a design researcher or UXer. And I think that's kind of a good foot in the door.
Thanks.
I'm thinking about like what you're saying about a lot of startups work in sprints, right, on the dev side. So the speed of this kind of development, and then bringing in service design and doing the design research, and basically how making that design research actionable in a sense that it can feed into in a timely manner into development sprints. And this is something that I would love to learn if you have a tip.
I wrote an article about it a few years ago. I think it's somewhere on my website. One of the things that my strong feelings is that if you're a service designer in a product team, you're kind of in the wrong place. You're stuck down, potentially in a startup, it could be different, but you're not having the real impact you could have if you were more strategic. So for one thing, I would try to feed and inform product teams with your learnings, but ideally don't sit within the product team, because then you don't have the buy-in or the influence or the mandate that you would ideally have if you're sitting outside the product team. If you find yourself there, the way I normally would do it is to figure out what the product team's sprint schedule is going to be like, maybe 2 or 3 weeks in advance. What things do they know they need to be focusing on, what user stories are being built or something like that. And then think, okay, what kind of research can I do so that by the time I've done research and reported on it, I can feed insights into the team, so that when the UX designer, for example, gets down to screen designs, they understand what you learned. So if you're in that situation, try to understand what's going to be built in the future and synchronize your work to do research before it becomes necessary. If you're working at their pace, you're working too slow, or you're working out of sync.
Yeah, not even, but also with continuous research. It's kind of when you have these kind of like chunks of research, you might have either missed, or yes, it's only coming in the future, but it might be relevant to know now also for future sprint planning when you think of it. So, but this is also what I've been thinking, is having a look at what the sprints are. And especially,
I think it's a great goal to try to implement continuous research and not just have this idea that the team thinks, okay, we can wash our hands, the design research is done and everything will be fine. A service is always evolving. It's a startup's work is never kind of complete, and therefore your research needs to be ongoing.
Yeah, so trying to find that balance of what, since it's ongoing research, how to feed it in a good manner.
Yep.
And it's quite challenging currently. Anyone else? Okay, so we're going to stay over if anybody has other questions later on when we finish off the official part. So you're invited to the backstage, and Amanda is going to take it over from here. I want to thank Jesse again for this great talk and an interesting conversation.
Okay, yeah, the slides and the resources are in the Miro that we've been looking at. So once they're unhidden, you'll find both the deck that I've presented. I have shared a copy of Touchpoint, which is the journal that I mentioned, where we had a whole issue on this topic, and some articles that I wrote. So you can find them there in the Miro.
They will also be in the email that will come to your inboxes probably tomorrow or Monday. Okay, so we just have a little ask for you. So we appreciate feedback on the event. What did you like? Why are you here? Is your first time? Tina will put this into the chat, and we really, really appreciate it. And we have a little invitation for everyone that's based in Slovenia. And if you, by any chance, find yourself in Slovenia on the July 8th, we're gonna grab a drink. It's in Spica. Also bring your friends, fellow UXers and service designers. And now it's it's Backstage time. And I have to say that it's our first event that did not run over time. So congratulations to everybody. And this is it for today from us. Please join us and we'll talk some more, have some drinks and hang out.
Start the season next year in October, this year. So season 21-22, starting October. So follow our social media links for updates.
That's right.